Sarah Martinez had always been small for her age, standing barely 5 feet tall with gentle brown eyes that seemed to hold secrets nobody bothered to ask about. At 32, she worked quietly as a librarian in the small town of Millfield, organizing books and helping children find stories about dragons and princesses. The townspeople knew her as the quiet woman who always wore long sleeves, even in the scorching summer heat that made everyone else strip down to tank tops and shorts. What they didn't know was that Sarah had spent 3 years in Afghanistan as a combat medic with the Army's 10th Mountain Division. What they couldn't see beneath her carefully chosen clothing were the thick, raised scars that crisscrossed her arms like a roadmap of violence and survival. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning when Sarah attended the monthly town council meeting. The topic was the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony, and Mayor Thompson was asking for volunteers to help organize the event. When Sarah quietly raised her hand and suggested they include a moment for female veterans, Councilman Richards laughed so hard his coffee cup rattled against the table. "Sarah, honey," he said with a condescending smile, "we appreciate your support for our boys who served, but this is about real veterans. You know, the ones who actually saw combat." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, but she kept her voice steady. "I am a veteran, Mr. Richards. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan." More laughter rippled through the small crowd. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the local diner, shook her head with a pitying smile. "Oh dear. We know you want to help, but let's leave the war stories to the men who were actually there." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of her metal folding chair. She could feel the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever people dismissed her service, whenever they looked at her small frame and gentle demeanor and decided she couldn't possibly have crawled through dust and blood to save wounded soldiers under enemy fire. "I was there," she said quietly, but her words were drowned out by the mayor calling for the next agenda item. After the meeting, Sarah walked home through the tree-lined streets of Millfield, past the white picket fences and manicured lawns that looked nothing like the rocky terrain of Helmand Province where she'd spent 27 months of her life. She passed the barber shop where old veterans gathered every morning to drink coffee and share stories that everyone believed without question, simply because they were men with gray hair and firm handshakes. At home, Sarah sat in her small kitchen and rolled up her sleeves for the first time in months. The scars were still there, of course, telling their silent story across her forearms. The long, jagged line from the IED that had thrown shrapnel through her ambulance window. The circular burn mark from the rocket-propelled grenade that had exploded too close to their forward operating base. The dozens of smaller marks from diving behind concrete barriers and crawling through rubble to reach wounded soldiers. Each scar held a memory that played in her mind like a broken film reel. She remembered Private Johnson, barely 18, crying for his mother as she applied pressure to his leg wound while bullets whined overhead. She remembered Sergeant Williams, tough as nails, holding her hand while she worked to stop the bleeding from his chest, whispering thank you over and over as the helicopter blades chopped the air above them. She remembered Captain Rodriguez, who had recommended her for a Bronze Star after she ran through enemy fire 3 times to evacuate wounded soldiers from a bombed patrol base. The medal sat in a drawer upstairs, wrapped in tissue paper, because there was no one in this town who would understand its significance. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her sister Maria, calling from Denver, where she worked as a nurse, and where people actually listened when Sarah talked about her military service. "How was the town meeting?" Maria asked, her voice warm and familiar. Sarah found herself telling the whole story, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. She told Maria about the laughter, about Mr. Richards' dismissive tone, about the way Mrs. Henderson had looked at her like she was a child playing dress-up. "You need to show them," Maria said firmly. "You need to make them understand." "How?" Sarah asked, staring down at her scars. "They don't want to believe. They've already decided what a veteran looks like. And it doesn't look like me." "Then change their minds," Maria said. "You didn't crawl through a war zone to come home and let ignorant people erase your service." After hanging up, Sarah sat in the gathering darkness of her kitchen, thinking about Maria's words. Outside, she could hear the sounds of suburban evening life. Children playing, dogs barking, the distant hum of lawnmowers. It was peaceful in a way that still sometimes felt foreign to her. This absence of the constant threat that had shaped 3 years of her life. She thought about her fellow soldiers, the ones who hadn't made it home, and the ones who had but carried invisible wounds that people like Mr. Richards would never acknowledge. She thought about the promises they had made to each other in those dusty forward operating bases. Promises to honor their service and never let anyone forget what they had sacrificed. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began typing. If the town wouldn't listen to her words, maybe they would listen to her story. She began with the day she had enlisted, 18 years old, and determined to serve her country. She wrote about basic training, about learning to save lives under pressure, about the day she had first set foot in Afghanistan and realized that everything she thought she knew about courage was wrong. The words came slowly at first, then faster as the memories poured out. She wrote until her hands cramped and her eyes burned, filling page after page with the truth that she had kept hidden beneath long sleeves and quiet smiles. She wrote about fear and brotherhood, about loss and hope, about the weight of responsibility that came with holding someone's life in your hands while the world exploded around you. As dawn broke over Millfield, Sarah finally stopped typing. She had written nearly 20 pages, a raw and honest account of her service that laid bare both her courage and her vulnerability. Now she had to decide what to do with it. The next morning, Sarah dressed carefully in a long-sleeved blouse and her most professional skirt. She printed her story and drove to the offices of the Millfield Gazette, the small weekly newspaper that covered town council meetings and high school football games with equal enthusiasm. Editor Jack Sullivan looked surprised when Sarah walked into his cluttered office. He knew her from the library, where he sometimes researched articles about local history, but they had never had more than brief conversations about overdue books and printing fees. "Sarah," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What brings you here?" Sarah placed the printed pages on his desk, her hands steadier than she expected. "I'd like you to publish this," she said. "It's my story, and I think people need to hear it." Jack picked up the first page and began reading. Sarah watched his expression change as he worked through her account, saw his eyebrows rise when he reached the part about the Bronze Star, saw him lean forward when she described treating wounded soldiers under fire. "Is this true?" he asked quietly when he finished. "Every word," Sarah said. Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring at the pages in his hands. Finally, he looked up at her. "Sarah, this is incredible. I had no idea. None of us did." "I know," she said. "I never told anyone. But after yesterday's meeting, I realized that staying quiet isn't helping anyone. There are other female veterans in this town, other people whose service gets ignored because they don't fit the stereotype." Jack nodded slowly. "Can I verify some of this? Not because I don't believe you, but because people will ask questions." Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a folder containing her discharge papers, her Bronze Star citation, and several photographs from her deployment. "I brought everything you might need," she said. As Jack examined the documents, Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and terror. For years, she had protected her privacy, hidden her service behind a facade of normalcy. Now she was about to strip away that protection and expose herself to the judgment of an entire town. "Sarah," Jack said finally, "I'd be honored to publish this, but I want you to understand what might happen. Some people are going to have a hard time accepting this. They're going to question you, maybe even attack you." Sarah thought about Private Johnson and Sergeant Williams and Captain Rodriguez. She thought about the promises made in dusty medical tents and the weight of responsibility that still woke her up some nights. "I've faced worse," she said. The Millfield Gazette hit the stands on Thursday morning, and by noon, Sarah's phone hadn't stopped ringing. The first call came from Mrs. Henderson at the diner, her voice shaky with what sounded like genuine remorse. "Sarah, honey, I just read your story in the paper. I had no idea. I'm so sorry for what I said at that meeting." Similar calls followed throughout the day. Some were apologetic, others curious, and a few were skeptical. But it was the call from Councilman Richards that Sarah had been dreading most. "Miss Martinez." His voice was cold and formal when she answered. "I've read this story of yours, and I have some serious questions. A lot of people are talking, and frankly, some of us find it hard to believe." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest. But this time, she didn't let it stop her. "What exactly do you find hard to believe, Mr. Richards?" "Well, for starters, women weren't allowed in combat roles when you claim to have served. And this Bronze Star business? That's a pretty serious medal to claim falsely." "I never claimed to be in a combat role," Sarah said evenly. "I was a medic, and medical personnel were often attached to combat units because soldiers get wounded in war. As for the Bronze Star, I earned it by doing my job under extremely dangerous conditions." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "We'll see about that," Richard said, before hanging up. That afternoon, Sarah returned to work at the library, unsure what kind of reception she would receive. She found a small crowd gathered near the front desk, including several people she recognized from the town council meeting. The conversation stopped when she walked in. "Sarah," said Tom Morrison, a local businessman whose son had served in Iraq, "I owe you an apology. I read your story, and I called my boy to ask him about female medics. He told me some stories that made my hair stand on end. I'm ashamed that I doubted you." Others in the group nodded agreement. But Sarah noticed that not everyone looked convinced. She could see the doubt in their eyes. The questions they weren't brave enough to ask directly. She decided it was time to stop hiding. "I know some of you still have questions," she said, setting down her purse and rolling up her sleeves for the first time in public. "Maybe this will help." The gasps were audible as her scars came into view. The jagged line on her left forearm, pale and raised against her brown skin. The circular burn mark near her wrist. The dozens of smaller scars that told stories of diving for cover and crawling through debris. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who organized the church bake sales, covered her mouth with her hand. "Oh, my dear," she whispered. "What happened to you?" Sarah looked down at her arms, then back at the gathered crowd. She pointed to the long scar. "Is from an IED that hit our convoy outside Kandahar. I was treating 2 wounded soldiers in the back of an ambulance when shrapnel came through the window." She moved to the burn mark. "This happened when our forward operating base was attacked with RPGs. I was running medical supplies to a bunker when one exploded about 30 feet away. The room was completely silent now, everyone staring at the physical evidence of experiences they could barely imagine." Sarah continued, pointing to smaller scars and telling their stories with a matter-of-fact tone that made them somehow more powerful. "I got most of these during my second deployment," she said, indicating a cluster of marks near her elbow. "That was when things got really bad. We were understaffed and under constant attack. I spent most of that year either treating wounded soldiers or diving for cover." Tom Morrison cleared his throat. "Sarah, why didn't you ever tell anyone? Why keep this secret?" Sarah considered the question for a moment. "Because every time I tried, people reacted like you did at the town meeting. They looked at me and saw a small woman who worked in a library, not someone who had crawled through a war zone to save lives. It was easier to stay quiet than to constantly prove myself." "But you have that medal," said another voice from the back of the group. "The Bronze Star. That's not something you can fake." "No, it's not," Sarah agreed. "But people don't usually ask to see it. They just decide what's possible, based on what they think they know." The conversation continued for another hour, with people asking questions about her service, her experiences, and why she had chosen to speak up now. Sarah answered honestly, describing the realities of military life for women, the challenges of serving in a male-dominated environment, and the difficulty of transitioning back to civilian life, when nobody acknowledged what you had been through. As the crowd eventually dispersed, Sarah felt emotionally drained, but oddly liberated. For the first time in years, She didn't feel like she was carrying her secrets alone. That evening, she received another phone call, this one from a woman named Jennifer Walsh, who lived 2 towns over. "I read your story online," Jennifer said, her voice tight with emotion. "I served 2 tours in Iraq as a military police officer. I've been living with the same thing you described, people who don't believe women can be real veterans." Sarah felt a surge of connection with this stranger. "What branch?" she asked. "Army, like you." "I was with the 101st Airborne. I've got my own collection of scars. But I've never shown them to anyone except doctors." They talked for 2 hours, sharing stories and experiences that they had never been able to discuss with anyone who truly understood. Jennifer told Sarah about coming home to a family that expected her to immediately become the same person she had been before deployment, not understanding that war changes everyone it touches. "I've been thinking about starting a support group," Jennifer said as their conversation wound down, "for female veterans in the area. After reading your story, I think maybe it's time." "I'd be interested," Sarah said. "I think there are probably more of us than people realize." Over the next few days, Sarah's story continued to spread beyond Millfield. Someone had shared the online version on social media, and it began reaching veterans and military families across the country. Her email inbox filled with messages from women who had similar experiences, men who wanted to apologize for their assumptions, and advocates who were fighting for better recognition of female veterans. But not all the attention was positive. On Saturday morning, Sarah arrived at the library to find graffiti spray-painted across the front windows. "Fake. Veteran. Stolen valor." She stared at the red letters, feeling a familiar mix of anger and exhaustion. Just as she was pulling out her phone to call the police, a pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. She tensed, unsure what to expect, but relaxed when she saw Tom Morrison climbing out of the driver's seat with a bucket and cleaning supplies. "Figured you might need some help with this," he said, gesturing at the graffiti. "My son is driving down from the city to help too. He wants to meet you, says he served with some female medics who were tougher than most of the men in his unit." As they worked to clean the windows, other people began arriving. Mrs. Henderson brought coffee and donuts from her diner. Mrs. Patterson showed up with more cleaning supplies and a fierce determination to scrub away every trace of the vandalism. Even Mayor Thompson appeared, looking embarrassed, and carrying a formal apology from the town council. "We want to do better," he told Sarah as they worked. "We're planning a proper Veterans Day ceremony this year, and we'd like you to be the keynote speaker." Quote, Sarah paused in her scrubbing, surprised by the request. "I'm not much of a public speaker," she said. "You don't need to be," Tom Morrison said. "You just need to tell the truth. That's what you did in your story. And look how many people it reached." As they finished cleaning the windows, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. The graffiti had been meant to shame and silence her, but instead, it had brought the community together in support of her service. She was beginning to understand that courage wasn't just about facing enemy fire. Sometimes it was about facing your neighbors and demanding that they see you for who you really are. That afternoon, Sarah received a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end identified himself as Sergeant Major Robert Chen, calling from the Pentagon. "Miss Martinez," he said, "your story has reached some people in high places. We're working on an initiative to better recognize the service of female veterans, and we'd like to invite you to Washington to share your experiences with some senior military leadership." Sarah felt overwhelmed. "I'm just a librarian now," she said. "I'm not anyone special." Miss Martinez," Sergeant Major Chen said firmly. "You earned a Bronze Star for valor under fire. You served 3 tours in a combat zone. You saved lives at considerable risk to your own. The fact that you work in a library now doesn't make you any less of a hero." Sarah looked around her small house, at the quiet life she had built for herself, away from the chaos and danger of her military service. She thought about all the other women who were fighting the same battles she had fought, trying to get recognition and respect for their service. "When do you need an answer?" she asked. "Take your time," Sergeant Major Chen said. But I hope you'll consider it. Your voice matters, and there are a lot of people who need to hear what you have to say." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her kitchen and rolled up her sleeves again, looking at her scars in the fading afternoon light. Each mark represented a moment when she had chosen courage over safety, service over self-preservation. Now, she was being asked to make that choice again, in a different way. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer Walsh. "Saw your story shared on a veterans Facebook group. Comments are incredible. You've started something important." Sarah smiled and typed back, "We've started something important. This is bigger than just my story." Outside, the sun was setting over Millfield, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Sarah could hear children playing in the park across the street, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. It was a peaceful sound, the kind of peace that she and thousands of other veterans had fought to preserve. She picked up her laptop and began typing again. This time, writing about the response to her story, about the community that had rallied around her, and about the responsibility that came with breaking the silence. If she was going to Washington, if she was going to become a voice for female veterans, then she needed to make sure she represented them well. The words came easier this time, flowing from a place of hope rather than pain. Sarah wrote about the strength it took to serve, and the different kind of strength it took to come home and demand recognition. She wrote about the scars that showed and the ones that didn't, about the bonds forged in combat zones and the new bonds being formed with fellow veterans who had felt invisible for too long. As midnight approached, Sarah saved her work and closed the laptop. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and new opportunities to tell the truth about women's service in combat zones. But tonight, for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't facing those challenges alone. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, surrounded by portraits of Medal of Honor recipients and feeling completely out of place in her borrowed business suit. The meeting with senior military leadership had grown into something much larger. A formal panel discussion about women's roles in combat and the challenges female veterans faced when returning to civilian life. The conference room was filled with generals, colonels, and civilian Department of Defense officials, along with a handful of other female veterans who had been invited to share their experiences. Sarah recognized some of the women from news articles and advocacy organizations, accomplished leaders who had fought for years to change military policy and public perception. "Miss Martinez," said General Patricia Hayes, a 2-star general who had been one of the first women to command a combat aviation brigade. "Your story has sparked quite a conversation. We've received hundreds of similar accounts from female veterans across all branches of service." Sarah nodded, still trying to process how her small-town newspaper article had led her to this room. "I never expected it to reach so many people. I work with," she said. "I was just tired of being invisible." "Invisibility is exactly what we need to address," said Colonel Martinez, a Marine officer whose last name coincidentally matched Sarah's. "We have women who served with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan, who earned Purple Hearts and Bronze Stars and Silver Stars. And they're coming home to communities that don't even acknowledge their service." The discussion continued for 2 hours, with each veteran sharing her story and the challenges she had faced. Sarah listened to accounts that mirrored her own experience. The disbelief, the dismissal, the assumption that real combat veterans were automatically male. She heard about women who had given up trying to access veterans' benefits because the process was so demoralizing, and others who had never applied for jobs that required security clearances because they assumed their military experience wouldn't be taken seriously. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she found herself talking not just about her own experiences, but about the phone calls and emails she had received since her story was published. "I've heard from women who served in Vietnam and were never even acknowledged as veterans for decades," she said. "I've heard from Iraq veterans who were told their PTSD wasn't real because women don't see real combat. I've heard from military police officers who were in firefights every day, but were told their service didn't count because they weren't infantry. She paused, thinking about Jennifer Walsh and the support group they had started, which now met twice a month and included 12 women from across 3 counties. But I've also heard from communities that are changing, she continued, from VFW posts that are actively recruiting female members, from employers who are specifically seeking to hire female veterans, from high schools that are inviting women to speak on Veterans Day alongside men. General Hayes leaned forward. What do you think needs to happen next? Sarah considered the question carefully. I think we need to change the conversation from the ground up. When people think about veterans, they automatically picture men. When they think about combat, they picture male soldiers with rifles. But war doesn't work that way anymore. Everyone who serves in a combat zone is at risk, whether they're carrying a weapon or a medical bag or driving a supply truck. She thought about Private Johnson and his tears, about Sergeant Williams holding her hand as she worked to save his life. The soldiers I treated didn't care that I was a woman. They just cared that I was there when they needed help. I think the public needs to understand that service comes in many forms, and courage doesn't have a gender. After the panel discussion, Sarah was approached by Dr. Rebecca Foster, a researcher from the Veterans Administration, who had been taking notes throughout the meeting. Ms. Martinez, would you be interested in participating in a larger study we're conducting on female veteran experiences? We're documenting cases like yours to help train VA staff and to develop better outreach programs. Sarah agreed immediately. Over the following months, she found herself traveling to various military bases and veterans facilities, sharing her story with groups of active duty service members and recently separated veterans. The audiences varied, but the reactions were consistently powerful. At Fort Bragg, she spoke to a group of soldiers preparing for deployment. A young female medic approached her afterward with tears in her eyes. "Ma'am, I've been worried about what it's going to be like when I come home," the soldier said. "My hometown is a lot like yours. They don't really believe women can be real soldiers. But hearing your story makes me feel like maybe I can change some minds." Sarah gave the young woman her contact information and promised to stay in touch. "Don't let anyone make you feel invisible," she said. "Your service matters, and your sacrifices matter. Don't let people diminish that because of their own limitations." The speaking engagements led to other opportunities. Sarah was invited to join the board of directors for a national organization supporting female veterans. She began writing regularly for military publications, contributing articles about the transition from military to civilian life and the importance of community support for veterans. But the work that meant the most to her was happening back in Millfield. The support group that she and Jennifer had started had grown into a regional network with chapters in 6 towns. They organized events for Veterans Day and Memorial Day, participated in career fairs to help female veterans find employment, and provided a safe space for women to process their experiences without judgment. The town of Millfield had also changed. The Veterans Day ceremony that year featured Sarah as the keynote speaker, but she shared the stage with 3 other female veterans from the area, including a Navy corpsman who had served in Iraq and an Air Force Security Forces member who had done 2 tours in Afghanistan. Councilman Richards, who had been so dismissive at that first town meeting, introduced Sarah with genuine respect and a public apology for his earlier comments. "I've learned something important this year," he told the crowd gathered in the town square. "A veteran is defined not by gender or appearance, but by willingness to serve something greater than oneself." The ceremony drew the largest crowd in the town's history, including several busloads of veterans from neighboring communities who came to show their support. Sarah spoke about service and sacrifice, about visible and invisible wounds, and about the responsibility everyone shared to support those who had served. "When we fail to recognize someone's service," she said, looking out at the crowd that included many of the same faces from that dismissive town council meeting, "we don't just hurt that individual. We diminish the value of all service. We suggest that some sacrifices matter more than others, that some courage is more worthy of respect." After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by a teenage girl whose mother had served in Iraq. My mom never talks about her deployment, the girl said. She gets really upset when people thank her for her service, because she says they don't really mean it. Do you think your story might help her? Sarah gave the girl her card and encouraged her to have her mother call. These conversations had become routine, family members reaching out for guidance on how to support female veterans, employers asking for advice on recruiting and retaining female veteran employees, community organizations seeking speakers for their events. 6 months after that first newspaper article, Sarah received a call from Sergeant Major Chen with unexpected news. Miss Martinez, the Army is developing a new training program for military transition assistance. We want to include modules specifically addressing the challenges faced by female service members returning to civilian life. We'd like you to help develop the curriculum. SI. Life. All OC. M Life. Life U. We want to be C. Sarah accepted the opportunity, though it meant taking a leave of absence from her library job to travel to various military installations and work with curriculum developers. The project took nearly a year, but the result was a comprehensive program that addressed everything from accessing veterans' benefits to dealing with civilian skepticism about women's military service. The program included videos featuring Sarah and other female veterans telling their stories, interactive exercises designed to help transitioning service members practice responding to doubt or dismissal, and resource guides connecting women with support networks in their communities. During one of the pilot sessions at Fort Campbell, Sarah watched a female sergeant participate in a role-playing exercise where she practiced responding to a job interviewer who questioned whether her military experience was relevant to civilian work. I spent 3 years as a combat engineer, the sergeant said confidently. I led teams, managed complex projects under pressure, and solved problems in high-stress environments. Those skills transfer directly to project management and leadership roles in the civilian sector. Watching these sessions, Sarah realized how far the conversation had evolved since that first dismissive town council meeting. The military was beginning to take seriously the unique challenges faced by female service members, and civilian communities were slowly learning to recognize and value women's military contributions. But the work was far from over. Sarah continued to receive emails and phone calls from women whose service was still being questioned, whose sacrifices were still being minimized, whose wounds, visible and invisible, were still being ignored. On the second anniversary of her first newspaper article, Sarah was back in Millfield for the annual Veterans Day ceremony. This time, she wasn't the keynote speaker. That honor went to Colonel Jennifer Walsh, who had been promoted and was now commanding a military police battalion. Sarah sat in the front row, wearing a sleeveless dress that displayed her scars without shame, watching as her friend addressed a crowd that included veterans from World War II to Afghanistan. The ceremony had become a model for other communities, featuring speakers from diverse backgrounds and acknowledging the full spectrum of military service. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by a young man who introduced himself as the son of Councilman Richards. "Miss Martinez," he said, "I wanted to thank you. My dad used to have some pretty narrow ideas about who could be a real veteran. Hearing your story changed his perspective, and honestly, it changed mine too. I'm thinking about enlisting. And I wanted you to know that when I do, I'll remember what you taught us about respecting all forms of service." As Sarah walked home through the familiar streets of Millfield, she reflected on how much had changed since that first painful town council meeting. She had found her voice, yes, but more importantly, she had helped other women find theirs. The scars on her arms were still there, still telling their stories of courage under fire. But now, they were part of a larger narrative about service, sacrifice, and the ongoing fight for recognition and respect. Her phone buzzed with a text message from the teenage girl whose mother had served in Iraq. "My mom started going to the support group you recommended. She's been sharing stories about her deployment for the first time ever. Thank you for giving her permission to be proud of her service." Sarah smiled as she climbed the steps to her front door. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to advocate for female veterans, and new stories from women who had found the courage to speak up about their experiences. But tonight, She was home in a community that had learned to see her for who she really was, not despite her scars, but because of everything those scars represented. The quiet librarian who had once hidden her service behind long sleeves and gentle smiles had become a national voice for female veterans. But perhaps more importantly, she had helped transform a small town's understanding of what it meant to be a hero. And in doing so, she had proven that sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought not with weapons, but with words, courage, and an unwavering commitment to truth.